Shavua Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Demai. We're up to Perek Vav Mishna Yud. The Mishnah now is going to continue discussing rules about two people dividing their inheritance, but this time it's going to include laws of idolatry, of Avodah Zarah. So now, just as a preface, a Jew is forbidden to receive any benefit from any idol. If he exchanges an idol for money or some other object, that item becomes a asur to benefit from, just like an idol. The same rule applies to yain nesach, wine that has been poured as a libation for an idol. Now, biblically, min Torah, it is forbidden to have benefit from such wine, and whatever a person receives in exchange for it, similarly, is asur to benefit from, just like the actual wine. Now, this can create a problem in a case where you have a convert to Judaism who inherits property from his father along with his non-Jewish brother who is an idolater. The Mishnah is going to discuss now how you would divide such an estate in such a case, in a situation where the item contains prohibited items for the convert along with his brother. Ger ve'oved kochavim she'arshu et aviem oved kochavim. So Mishnah Yud says, if a convert to Judaism and an idolater inherited the property of their father who was an idolater, when they come to divide the inheritance, the convert can say to his brother, Tol ata avodah zarah v'ani meot, ata yain v'ani perot. You take the idols and I'll take the money, or you take the nesach wine and I'll take the permissible produce. Because the Mefarshim explain, even though items normally received in exchange for idols or yain nesach are asur to benefit from, in this case, the money or the produce received by the convert in exchange for his share of the idols or wine is permitted, because the Mefarshim explain, since a convert does not inherit his non-Jewish father under biblical law, he doesn't really own a share of the idols or the wine. So for this reason, the items that he receives in place of them are not considered to have come to him in exchange for them. And that would make it mutar. And the Mefarshim point out to us that under biblical law min Torah, if somebody converts to Judaism, is considered ger kinolad dami. A convert is considered like a newborn baby, like a newborn child, meaning a new person was not legally related to his birth parents. So for this reason, the convert cannot legally inherit from his natural father on a biblical level, since he's no longer legally his son. The Chachamim made a decree that a convert can inherit from his father, because they didn't want the convert to be tempted to go back to idolatry in order to receive his father's money. So now, the reason it would be allowed here is because normally brothers who inherit their father, they become equal partners in every item of the estate from the moment the father dies. Had this been the case here, let's say here the convert, it would have legally inherited the items with his brother right away, he would be asur to exchange it for money or for any other property in exchange for the idols or the nesach wine. However, since here you have a convert who doesn't legally inherit his father under the biblical law, when he offers the idols as a trade to his brother, he's not trading idols for money. Why? Because the idols are really not his to trade. He's simply assigning it to his brother as the brother's share of the inheritance. Since the money that he gives back doesn't really come in exchange for the idols, it's permitted for him to have benefit from it. And even though midrabanan, the rabbis made a decree that he does receive a share of his father's inheritance, they only did it for items that are permitted for him to benefit from, and not for the idols and the nesach wine that are asur to him. Therefore, even after the rabbinical decree that he does inherit, he doesn't actually take any share in the idols or in the wine. But the Mishnah continues, however, once the idols or the nesach wine come into the convert's physical possession, means he received them as part of the share and he took possession of them, he now legally owns them, and therefore asur. It's forbidden for him to exchange them for money or for produce, and if he does, he would not be allowed to benefit from them, just like by the actual idols or the not yain nesach. That is in Rabotai Mishna Yud. Mishna Yud Aleph is going to turn now to a new topic. It's going to discuss now an Amaretz who sells produce in Syria. Now the Mefarshim tell us, if you look at the Rav, Syria is the lands of Aram Naharaim and Aram Sova, that were conquered and they were annexed to Eretz Yisrael by David HaMelech. It's really known as nowadays Syria, according to the Tiferet Yisrael. Now, the Mefarshim tell us in some ways Syria is treated like Eretz Yisrael, and in other ways it is treated like the land outside Israel. And the Mefarshim tell us, the Rav says, that David HaMelech, he conquered Syria before he conquered all of Eretz Yisrael. Therefore, did not acquire the holiness of Eretz Yisrael. However, the rabbis, the Chachamim, decree that Syria should have some laws, should have the same laws as Eretz Yisrael in regard to some matters. Now, produce that was grown in Jewish land in Syria is subject to the laws of Terumah Maaser Midrabanan. So the Mishnah now is going to explain how do we have the laws of Demai in such a situation. Hamocher perot b'Syria. If an Am Haaretz sells produce in Syria, v'amar mishen Eretz Yisrael, and he says it is from Eretz Yisrael, chayav la'aser, the buyer is now obligated to tithe it, because we know that produce from Eretz Yisrael is subject to the laws of tithing, even if it is brought to another country, as the Ramban in his Perush Mishnah tells us. So since the Am Haaretz says that this produce is from Eretz Yisrael, the buyer has to treat it as Demai and separate the necessary tithes. Why? Because from the fact that this Am Haaretz says it came from Eretz Yisrael, the seller is now saying that it's chayav in Maasrot. And since he's an Am Haaretz, we cannot trust him that he tithed it. Therefore, the seller has to tithe it. However, if the seller wouldn't have said anything, he would have not mentioned that it came from Eretz Yisrael, the buyer would not have to tithe. He would have not had to tithe the produce. Why? Because since most of the produce sold in Syria was not going in Eretz Yisrael or Syria, but it came outside the land of Israel, it would not be obligated to Umot Masrot, as the Rav tells us. Now, these places we learned earlier in Perek Aleph, Mishnah Gimel, they were not included in the decree of Demai. So a person who would buy produce in Syria would assume that it doesn't need to be tithed. But since the Am Haaretz told him it's from Eretz Yisrael, he would now be obligated to tithe them. Meusarinen, but if the Am Haaretz added, it came from Eretz Yisrael, but it's already tithed, Ne'emani would be believed, and the buyer would not have to tithe it, and the Mishnah says, why? It's because of a logic. The mouth that prohibited the produce is the same mouth that permitted it. Meaning the Mefarshim say, just like we believe the Am Haaretz to prohibit the produce, meaning we require it to be tithed because he said it came from Eretz Yisrael, so too we believe him in the present that when he permits it, by saying it's mutar, that it doesn't have to be tithed because he says it was already tithed. Meaning, just like we believe him that it's a sur, we now believe him that it's mutar. And the Mefarshim explained to us the novelty concept. Even though an Am Haaretz generally is not believed when he says that his produce is tithed, we don't believe him because his word is not enough to remove a definite obligation of tevel. In this case, the obligation to tithe the produce only took effect because of his statement that it came from Eretz Yisrael. If he would have said that it came from outside of Eretz Yisrael, or if he wouldn't have said anything at all, we would have been believed. It would have been treated like any other produce that's sold in Syria, which doesn't have to be tithed. So since the only reason we are tithing it is because he told us it has to be tithed, it came from Eretz Yisrael, we also have to accept his word when he tells us that it is already tithed. Novelty concept of the Mishnah called the Pesha Asar with Pesha Etir, the mouth that prohibited is the same mouth that permitted. Now the Mishnah continues, Mishelihen, if the Am Haaretz tells us that this produce is from my own field here in Syria, Chayav La'aser, the buyer is obligated to tithe it, because since produce that's grown in Syria is obligated, Midrabanan, it has the obligation of Demai, if it was known that it grew there. Since he told us that it was grown there, we now have to tithe it. Meusarinen, but if the Am Haaretz added, the produce is from my field here in Syria, but it's tithed. Again, the Eman is believed. Why? The mouth that prohibited by saying that it came from his field and now the produce is Syria, you have to tithe it. It's the same mouth that permitted it by saying that it already has been tithed. However, the Mishnah concludes, if it's known, however, that the seller has one field, at least one field in Syria, chayav la'aser, the buyer is now obligated to tithe the produce, because now the produce is considered as demai, even if the seller would have not told us that it came from his field. Why? Because since we know that he owns one field in Syria, we assume that the produce that he is selling came from his field. Therefore, here we would have to tithe it because of demai, even without his word. So now, since we don't care about his word, it was automatically asur. We therefore have no basis to believe him that he tithed his produce. There's no concept here of a pesha asar with pesha etil, the mouth that prohibited, the same mouth that permitted, because the produce was prohibited to begin with, since we knew that he has at least one field in Syria here, and we would assume that's where his produce came from. Therefore, there's no basis to believe him to say when he says that the produce is tithed. That is the end of today's Mishnah. Rabotai, Baruch Adonai Leolam, Amen v'Amen.